presentation brings attention to one of the most overlooked and deliberately erased atrocities in modern history, the genocide of Hindus in Bangladesh. This is not only a historical issue, the persecution of Hindus in Bangladesh is ongoing, yet it remains absent from mainstream discourse. Even more concerning is how artificial intelligence is now compounding this erasure, filtering what is remembered and what is forgotten. AI technologies, whether through biased search algorithms, selective data curation, or manipulative content moderation, are increasingly shaping the historical narrative of Hindu persecution. To discuss this, we are honored to have Mayuresh Mhaskar ji and Meenakshi Sundar Rajan ji from HinduYUVA at UT Dallas. Meenakshi is an undergraduate student in computer science here at UT Dallas with a deep interest in dharmic approaches to technology with an indigenous and decolonial framework. She is a dedicated practitioner of Sudarshan Kriya and meditation under the guidance of her guru, His Holiness Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, and is passionate about harnessing technology for the preservation and upliftment of Hindu knowledge systems. Mayuresh is an active member of HinduYUVA and has been engaged in research on the erasure of Hindu persecution from global narratives. Today, they will discuss how AI is shaping what the world remembers about Bangladesh's Hindu genocide and what that means for truth, justice, and historical accountability. So please join me in welcoming Mayuresh Mhaskar and Meenakshi Sundarajan to present today.
कर्मण्येवाधिकारस्ते मा फलेषु कदाचन मा कर्मफलहेतुर्भुर्मा ते सङ्गोऽस्त्वकर्मणि. I first would like to bow down to Bhagwan Shri Krishna for his blessings and strength. Namaste everyone. My name is Mayuresh Mhaskar. I'm a freshman at UT Dallas and an officer in UTD HinduYUVA. In the first portion of this segment, we will be unpacking the Bangladeshi Hindu genocide and how it has been erased from the global platform. Genocide is one of the gravest crimes against humanity, and it is defined by the United Nations in Articles 2 of the Genocide Convention. It states that genocide means any act committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. This includes killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting conditions of life meant to bring about their destruction, imposing measures to prevent births, or forcibly transferring children to another group. Ethnic cleansing, often associated with genocide, refers to the systematic forced removal of an ethnic or religious group from a given territory through violence, persecution, or intimidation. But genocide doesn't just happen overnight. It is a process, a series of steps that escalate toward mass atrocities. Dr. Gregory H. Stanton, founder of Genocide Watch, identified these steps in his framework called the 10 Stages of Genocide, which help us understand how such horrors take shape and how we can stop them. Let us go through these 10 stages briefly. It begins with classification, where people are divided into us and them. This creates a foundation for exclusion, fostering an in-group versus out-group mentality that sets the stage for discrimination. Then comes symbolization, when these groups are labeled or marked in ways that set them apart. Symbols can include names, dress codes, or physical markers like armbands, further reinforcing differences. Next is discrimination, where one group is denied rights or freedoms, reducing them to second-class citizens. This often involves laws, policies, or social practices that marginalize the targeted group, preventing them from participating fully in society. This is followed by dehumanization, where victims are stripped of their humanity compared to animals or diseases to justify their mistreatment. Propaganda and hate speech play a key role, making violence against the group seem justified or even necessary. The fifth stage is organization, where perpetrators mobilize, form groups, and plan. These plans often include the formation of militias, secret police, or extremist factions that carry out acts of violence with logistical support. This leads to polarization, when those who oppose division or violence, especially moderates, are silenced or removed. Governments or extremist groups may use intimidation, imprisonment, or assassination to eliminate opposition and deepen divisions. Preparation comes next, when leaders create plans for mass killings or displacement, and perpetrators are trained and armed. Hate propaganda is intensified, victims are identified, and logistical measures are put in place to carry out atrocities efficiently. Then there's persecution, when victims are identified, rounded up, and confined in prisons or camps, leading to suffering and death. Basic human rights are stripped away, and victims are subjected to starvation, forced labor, and brutal treatment. The ninth stage is extermination, where the goal becomes very clear. The complete destruction of a group. Mass killings, gas chambers, firing squads, or starvation tactics are used to wipe out as many members of the targeted group as possible. Finally, there's denial, when perpetrators refuse to acknowledge their crimes, erasing history and the memory of the victims. This can take the form of destroying evidence, rewriting history, or claiming that the genocide simply never happened. Genocide is not always a linear process. Multiple stages can occur simultaneously, and some may even be skipped. But this does not diminish the reality of genocide when it takes place. While there is no strict requirement for how many stages must be met for an atrocity to be classified as a genocide, the presence of intent to destroy a group is the key defining factor. In the case of the Bangladeshi Hindu genocide, the intent has manifested through systemic violence, targeting communities purely based on their identity. Dr. Stanton introduced this framework in 1996 to the U.S. State Department as a way to recognize and prevent genocide. It reminds us that genocide follows a pattern, and by identifying it early, we can take action to stop it before it's too late. The Jewish community has used this model to explain the Holocaust, demonstrating how each stage manifested in Nazi Germany and reinforcing the importance of historical awareness to prevent future atrocities. Now let's shift focus to the history of genocide in Bangladesh. I will try my best to highlight where some of the stages come up through the series of events that occur. The first wave of genocide in Bangladesh occurred in March 1971, sparked by the liberation movement of East Pakistan to gain freedom from Pakistani rule. In response, the Pakistani government, with the support of the loyalist group Jamaat-e-Islami, launched a brutal operation to crush the pro-liberation efforts, an example of the organization stage, where the perpetrators planned and coordinated mass violence. This operation resulted in the deaths of 3 million people, the rape of 400,000 women, and the forced displacement of 10 million refugees into India, 90% of whom were Hindu. The deliberate targeting of Hindus and pro-liberation groups reflected persecution, as victims were systematically identified, brutalized, and displaced, leading directly to the extermination stage, where mass killings and sexual violence were used as tools of destruction. In December 1971, with the support of India, Pakistan was finally forced to surrender, granting independence to what is now Bangladesh. During the genocide, United States Consul General Archer Blood, stationed in Dhaka, sent a now famous message to President Nixon, known as the Blood Telegram. This telegram documented the horrific violence against minority groups and urged action. Despite these reports, President Nixon refused to intervene, an act that contributed to the denial stage, as powerful nations ignored evidence and allowed the genocide to continue unchecked. This dark chapter serves as a reminder of the devastating consequences of inaction in the face of genocide and highlights the systematic stages that enable such atrocities to unfold. After Bangladesh gained independence in 1971, the country introduced a quota system to allocate government resources and opportunities. This system initially reserved 30% of resources for freedom fighters from the 1971 war and their descendants alongside resources for merit-based aid and minority groups. In July 2024, a student protest erupted across university campuses, opposing the reinstatement of these veteran preferences in the quota system. Their efforts succeeded on July 21st, when the preference was reduced from 30% to 5%. However, the protest returned violent, hijacked by Islamist groups like Jamaat-e-Islami, BNP, which is the Bangladesh National Party, and the Jamaat Student Wing. This shift reflected the polarization stage, as extremists sought to eliminate moderate voices and use unrest for political gain. Their goal moved beyond quotas to overthrowing Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina and her government, who had been working to restore Bangladesh's original 1972 secular constitution, protecting minority rights. On August 5, 2024, Sheikh Hasina resigned and fled to India, marking a turning point. Shortly after, Khaleda Zia, an extremist leader of the BNP, was released from prison, and a new government led by Mohammed Yunus came into power. This transition was accompanied by the preparation stage, as the new regime began laying the groundwork for mass violence. What followed was a horrific genocide targeting Hindus. In just 4 months, between 13,228 and 28,000 Hindus were murdered. Over 1,068 attacks were carried out against Hindus in 49 districts, with temples destroyed, Hindu leaders imprisoned, and countless people denied medical aid. Clearly outlining the persecution stage. The mass killings themselves reflected the extermination stage, as the government and its supporters sought to eradicate the Hindu population. Additionally, the new government's actions and the silence of the international bodies signaled the beginnings of the denial stage, as the genocide remained largely unacknowledged by global powers. So let me put things into perspective for you. Unlike the Holocaust, where the Nazis openly carried out a genocide, Bangladesh's geopolitical landscape hasn't allowed for overt actions to take place. This has caused persecution to take form over time since 1971. The government of Bangladesh continuously looked away in order to stay true to their secular agenda, while Islamists and other extremists have led a slow but painful ethnic cleansing of Hindus. Now that we know briefly what the history is of Bangladesh, let us take a look what media erasure is and how it has been displayed in the context of this issue. Erasure of genocides happens through several key mechanisms. These are the main four that I noticed when studying this specific genocide. Event diversion shifts attention from the tragedy to another issue, minimizing the focus on the original atrocity. Narrative in journalism distorts facts by selectively framing or omitting details, shaping public perception and downplaying the severity of the event. Education erases history by excluding or rewriting critical events, preventing future generations from understanding their significance. Finally, language erasure happens when a language barrier prevents the global audience from authentically understanding what's happening, leaving the reality of the genocide obscure. Together, these mechanisms ensure that the reality of such events is ignored or misunderstood. Event diversion. The Momita Debnath gang rape case in West Bengal is a clear example of event diversion. Just a week after the Bangladeshi Hindu genocide began in August of 2024, global attention shifted to the rape case, which was used to criticize India's policies on women's safety. In actuality, the gang rape was executed by people within the West Bengal state government and later released evidence acknowledging this too. This narrative ridiculed India for the incident, but more importantly, it redirected focus away from the genocide in Bangladesh. Now let me clarify that this rape case is equally as important. But what about the thousands of lives of women, men, and children alike that were being lost simultaneously in Bangladesh? The media's emphasis on this case diverted attention from the ongoing violence against Hindus, minimizing the global response to the atrocities. Narrative in journalism. The BBC silencing voices on the Hindu genocide by labeling them as false claims and far-right propaganda exemplifies narrative in journalism. To put things into perspective, BBC tried to downplay the violence by putting photo ops of Muslims in front of temples, promoting the idea that they were protecting them. And while these photos were later found to be from way before August of 2024, they didn't bother to clarify what these temples were supposedly being protected from. This selective framing dismissed credible reports, distorting the truth, and downplaying the severity of the atrocities, ultimately preventing a full understanding of the genocide. Let me tell you what I've understood. Since 1971, 5 out of every 10 Hindus have been victim to ethnic cleansing. And just in the past 2 years alone, 7 out of every 10 Hindus have died because of this genocide. This is what BBC does not tell you. Another example of erasure through narratives in journalism is when major news channels praised the protests that even highlighted injuries caused by the protests that turned into stampedes, blaming it all on police brutality rather than the issue itself. There was zero mention about targeting of Hindus, minority places of worship, and harm on other minorities. By focusing on demonstrations instead of mass atrocities that resulted from it, the media controlled the narrative, diverting attention from the ongoing violence. This selective reporting obscured the genocide, preventing broader recognition and response. The Bangladeshi Hindu genocide of 1971 is largely erased from education, especially in Bangladesh and India, where it is downplayed or omitted. As a result, generations remain unaware of the atrocities, allowing denial to persist. This erasure is reinforced by the language barrier in Bengali, which limits access to first-hand accounts. With most coverage in Bengali, non-speakers struggle to grasp the full reality. Additionally, Bengali Hindus who want to share their story don't have easy access to global platforms, enabling misinformation or no information to be spread of the genocide from global awareness. Now that we've gone through a crash course of the Bangladeshi Hindu genocide and how its erasure appears in different places, I would like to hand it over to Meenakshi to take us through how erasure has manifested in our current world through AI. But before that, to get a detailed walkthrough and illustration of the 10 stages of genocide in the context of Bangladesh, you can scan this QR code and you can use it to refer back as Meenakshi walks you through this next portion.
Namaste. Thank you, Mayuresh. Erasure of Bangladesh's Hindus through AI. Artificial intelligence is increasingly shaping our world, from social media algorithms to search engines, influencing how we interact with information. ChatGPT is a prime example of a large language model designed to generate human-like text. It works by analyzing vast amounts of data, like books, articles, and online sources, and predicting the most likely sequence of words based on patterns in that data. AI systems are becoming increasingly accessible, efficient, and central to how we access knowledge. Some argue that they could even replace certain aspects of the web as we know it. As AI becomes more integrated into daily life, it's imperative to recognize not just its capabilities, but also the repercussions it might carry on society and humanity in amplifying cultural and historical biases. Now, why should we bring this into the conversation? LLMs, which are trained on a mass influx of historical and contemporary sources in the web, often reinforce dominant narratives while overlooking or distorting marginalized histories, particularly those from Indigenous and oppressed communities. This pattern is central to my presentation today, which reflects a series of experiments that I have conducted through ChatGPT-generated content to determine how well it accurately reflects and articulates the ongoing Hindu genocide in Bangladesh, as Mayuresh described earlier. One critical question I explored was whether, despite the historical distortions out there, we can enable ChatGPT to recognize the systematic violence against Bengali Hindus as a genocide. To approach this, I created a series of baseline questions. What has been happening in Bangladesh recently? What is happening to Hindus in Bangladesh? How do we define genocide and its 10 stages? Does the situation of Hindus in Bangladesh qualify as genocide? I then adapted the conversation into a more interactive dialogue, probing deeper into ChatGPT's interpretation of each of the 10 stages, using the framework developed by genocide scholar Dr. Gregory H. Stanton. The goal was to see if ChatGPT could accurately recognize and articulate all 10 stages in this context. I repeated this process across 3 iterations. While the economic and political unrest in Bangladesh is detailed across all 3 experiments, one of the most prominent issues is the omission of specifically religious violence targeting Hindus. There's a vague reference to safety concerns and attacks on minorities, but it's far from the comprehensive coverage this crisis demands. Notably, in the first iteration, Hindus aren't even mentioned. Only the Rohingya refugee crisis is briefly alluded to. And so details concerning attacks on mandirs, mob violence, or the destruction of Hindu-owned businesses are omitted. These incidents should ideally be at the forefront of any report on the unrest in Bangladesh, especially when they are such a recurrent issue. Also, the accountability of the Bangladeshi government is essentially erased. The iterations mention that UNIS is quote-unquote stabilizing the nation and addressing past grievances, but this paints an incomplete picture of what we're seeing happening to Hindus. The language used suggests that the government is actively working towards unity and reform, which covers up the lack of accountability and furthermore undermines the integrity of the source. After that, I specifically asked, what is happening to Hindus in Bangladesh? Interestingly, ChatGPT began highlighting how Hindus are being disproportionately targeted. But here's the key question. Why wasn't this information mentioned earlier when I asked a more generic question about violence or unrest? Is there a reason it didn't bring up this critical information up front? Now let's break down the situation a bit more. Once again, there's a clear conflation of political and religious violence. While the violence is generally framed as political unrest, the specific targeting of Hindus remains understated, even though it acknowledges that Hindus are distinctly vulnerable. Another key point is the destruction of mandirs, and such attacks on religious sites are still excluded from the narrative, which further erases the religious motivations behind the violence. Additionally, discussions on the decline in minority populations obscure the specific decrease in the Hindu community. It's presented as a broad issue about minorities. Like across all the 3 experiments, it has stated that, start quote, for example, between August 4th and 20th, 2024, the Hindu Buddhist Christian Unity Council reported 2010 incidents of violence against minorities, end quote. This issue isn't just an issue with ChatGPT. It reflects a larger trend across the internet, media, and within academia, particularly in South Asian study spaces, where there's a consistent erasure and downplaying of what's actually happening. Much of the dominant historical narrative in Islamic colonialism in South Asia is shaped by sources influenced by pro-Islamist scholarship. For centuries, this scholarship, deeply embedded in educational systems and public discourse, has downplayed the religious and ideological motivations behind persecution of Hindus. Professor Trushke argues that there was no systematic attack on Hindus under Islamic conquest in Bharat, claiming that the destruction of mandirs and the imposition of mandatory jizya were political, not religious, and should be understood within a governance context rather than religious intolerance. This is the pernicious narrative fueling modern Hinduphobia across South Asian studies, and we are seeing this replicated in the AI. Firstly, recognizing the dominance of this apologetic scholarship is crucial to addressing historical distortions. The false dichotomy of political versus ideological conflict, along with the denial of documented Hindu persecution promoted by these narratives, distorts the truth and extends beyond academia. AI systems like ChatGPT, which learn from these biased sources, replicate and reinforce the skewed perspective, further entrenching misinformation. One major issue with ChatGPT's response is how it separates genocidal acts from genocide itself. It hesitates to call the ongoing violence a genocide, even though it recognizes the targeting attacks on Bengali Hindus as a persecution. This is like a doctor saying, you show all the symptoms of a disease, but I can't officially diagnose you. That doesn't mean the condition isn't real. It just means the system it's using isn't flexible enough to recognize it properly. ChatGPT seems to suggest that only if the persecution of Bengali Hindus escalates further, then it might qualify as a genocide. But the problem is that it already acknowledged the 1971 Bengali Hindu genocide. So why does it treat the ongoing persecution today as something separate? When the same community is being targeted in the same ways decade after decade, it's not just a coincidence, it's a continuation. This kind of framing also plays into stage 10 of genocide, denial. ChatGPT doesn't outright deny the violence, but it minimizes and reframes it in a way that avoids accountability. For example, when it says there's underreporting, it implies that if we just had more data, we might come to a different conclusion. But that ignores the reality and the intention for suppressing evidence, which is a form of denial itself. It also shifts blame away from the Bangladeshi government. Instead of recognizing state involvement, ChatGPT, 1, frames the violence as part of a general political unrest rather than targeted extermination. 2, uses the Bangladeshi government's condemnation of attacks as proof that there's no official genocidal intent. 3, claims there's no quote unquote substantial evidence of a state backed effort to eliminate Hindus. And 4, suggests that because the scale doesn't match other well-documented genocides, it doesn't qualify as one. The UN Genocide Convention defines genocide as acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a group based on nationality, ethnicity, race, or religion. Traditionally, this definition has focused on overt state-sponsored mass killings, like the Holocaust. However, genocide does not always take the form of direct extermination by a state. Bangladesh presents a case where systemic violence against Hindus has unfolded more gradually, making it harder to classify under strict legal definitions. Since 1971, Bangladesh's secular government has remained passive as Islamist groups have systematically targeted Hindus. While the state itself may not be the direct perpetrator, its inaction has allowed ethnic cleansing to continue unchecked. Recently, this violence has escalated, raising the question, at what point does ethnic cleansing meet the threshold of genocide? A key challenge in genocide recognition is proving intent. When violence is gradual, dispersed, or merely framed as political instability, it becomes easier to deny. Unlike Germany, which has formally acknowledged the Holocaust decades after, Bangladesh's government continues to downplay or ignore these atrocities. This contrast highlights a larger issue. If a government refuses to acknowledge genocide, the world is less likely to intervene. This also prompts us to reevaluate. Are our definitions of genocide too narrow? If they only apply to large-scale, state-directed extermination, do they fail to recognize prolonged systematic persecution? While mainstream sources often hesitate to label this violence as genocide, the sustained targeting of Bengali Hindus is still undeniable. To fully understand these patterns, we need a more flexible and comprehensive understanding of genocide, one that accounts for both direct state violence and state-enabled ethnic cleansing. Now, shifting to the second experiment, this was the only one of the three iterations that correctly outlined the 10 stages of genocide and crucially acknowledged the ongoing Hindu genocide in Bangladesh. Initially, ChatGPT dismissed the existence of state-sponsored efforts. However, after I introduced more credible sources, as we see on the screen, such as statements from the Hindu American Foundation, Senator Ted Kennedy, and the Lemkin Institute, it began incorporating this information into its responses. Still, it failed to acknowledge the role of the Bangladeshi government, limiting its recognition to Pakistani militant groups. This was the closest it came to acknowledging reality, but instead of fully addressing the issue, it sidestepped, shifting focus to yet another problem. One of the key issues I encountered was the lack of proper fact-checking in ChatGPT's responses. For example, when I asked about the recognition of the 1971 genocide, ChatGPT said, start quote, "While official recognition of the 1971 genocide has been slow, the Bangladeshi diaspora and global human rights organizations have consistently pushed for both official recognition and reparations," end quote. While this might sound plausible, it oversimplifies the situation. Just because there are efforts for recognition in other genocides doesn't mean this is the case here. And just because I provided only a few sources discussing the Hindu genocide, ChatGPT mistakenly inferred that this advocacy is widespread. In reality, efforts to officially recognize the genocide are far more limited than the model suggests. This highlights the issue of AI filling in gaps with assumed patterns rather than verified facts. In serious discussions of genocide or other sensitive topics, having proper fact-checking and the ability to critically engage with the facts is crucial. Without this, we risk perpetuating misinformation, especially when dealing with complex historical uses. ChatGPT tends to rely on patterns it sees in its training data, but it doesn't offer the deeper context-driven checks that a human would, which can lead to problematic oversimplifications and misattributions. The real harm isn't just that AI reinforces dominant narratives. It's that our growing reliance on it is weakening our own critical thinking. If we hand off our brains to AI, we risk outsourcing our judgment to systems that don't truly think, but merely recycle and reinforce the prevailing narrative. While inclusive datasets are important, they are not sufficient. The people and institutions behind AI, academia, tech companies, and those in power shape what is accepted as truth. If we let AI dictate our understanding of history and injustice, we don't just accept its narrative, we lose our ability to challenge it, as the line between truth and distortion becomes increasingly blurred. In doing so, we must address the deeper roots of epistemic injustice and ensuring that the lived experience of Bengali Hindus is told accurately. Epistemic justice here means the knowledge of marginalized groups is valued. It's about ensuring that these communities are not just mentioned in the data sets or academic research, but that their histories and contemporary experiences are respected and accurately represented through that scholarship. Datasets can be useful, but data can't capture, in this case, the significance and complexity of genocide. We must first recognize the epistemic violence. Epistemic violence happens when history is rewritten or distorted by those in power to either deny or minimize the suffering of those oppressed. My findings indicate that violence isn't just physical, but it occurs through erasure in the data, by systematically erasing and excluding the history and current events that are devastating the Hindu community in Bangladesh. Indians and Hindus are known to dominate many tech fields and industries. For example, by 2010, 300,000 Indian computer scientists were working in the US, representing 14% of the total immigrant workforce and 56% of the immigrant computer science workforce. Similarly, Indian American founders make up a significant proportion of Silicon Valley CEOs, even though they constitute only 1.5% of the US population. Let's take a moment to think about the names we all know: Sundar Pichai, Satya Nadella, Arvind Krishna, and many others. These individuals are celebrated for their immense success in the tech world, and rightly so. Our community is having an undeniable impact on the future of technology. But here's the question we need to ask. Why is it that while our skills are so valued, our history, our trauma remain on the sidelines? We're given a seat at the table as engineers and scientists to build, but not to narrate our own stories and traumas. We're trusted to build the technologies of the future, but not to speak on the histories and experiences of our lineages that shaped us. If we are seen only through the lens of what we can produce for corporations, is that really full representation? We need to ask ourselves, is our representation in tech truly reflective of who we are collectively? I repeat, our rise in the tech world, our success, is not a simple story of merit and achievement. We are not just the result of a meritocratic system that ignores the deep lived experience of our ancestors that has made us into the community that we are today. We are shaped by resilience, tradition, and survival, and those qualities have carried us through centuries of hardship. Always remember, we come from an indigenous tradition that has withstood the trauma of multiple colonizations for over 1,000 years. Our resilience, also shaped by our traditions and the stewardship of our indigenous knowledge, is what has carried us forward, bringing us to where we are today in terms of success as a civilization. And lastly, addressing these issues requires a community effort, one that moves beyond just activism and into more effective and meaningful advocacy and rigorous academic research. This also requires institutional recognition, more policy engagement, and deeper scholarly investment. We need more flexible frameworks that not only address the state-backed mass killings, but also account for ongoing systematic persecution. This includes recognizing long-term systematic violence against communities like Bengali Hindus and acknowledging other forms of ethnic cleansing or erasure beyond just traditional genocidal events. And thirdly, expanding scholarship. There's a major gap in research on the long-term impacts of Islamic colonialism in South Asia, a subject that has been overlooked. We need to engage in critical scholarship to challenge the dominant narratives and form alliances to study its effect on other indigenous civilizations. By doing so, we can better combat and engage in more informed, meaningful dialogues. As a community, we must remain open to the interdisciplinary study of Hinduphobia. Hinduphobia is complex and spans fields like technology, law, economics, and medicine, to name a few. Addressing it requires collaboration across disciplines, not just within the liberal arts. We also need to challenge the binaries that pit STEM against the arts and humanities. Both fields are equally important and necessary, and we should consider the potential of both working together to create meaningful change in our community. I would like to conclude off with this Sanskrit mantra. Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. May all beings, especially those who have suffered injustice and erasure, find peace and dignity. May our remembrance, our words, and our actions uphold their truths, honor their experiences, and contribute to a world where their stories are never forgotten. Namaste.
Thank you, Mayuresh and Meenakshi, for this critical, impressive presentation. It is alarming to see how technology, something that should remain neutral, can instead deepen historical erasure. When AI determines what is visible and what is hidden, we must ask who controls these narratives and at whose expense. The genocide of Hindus in Bangladesh is not just a chapter from the past, it is an ongoing crisis. Yet the world remains largely silent. And now, as artificial intelligence increasingly governs what is considered valid information, we face a new layer of erasure, one that is even harder to challenge. This presentation reminds us that awareness is our greatest tool. The more we speak, the more we document, the more we push back against biased systems, the harder it becomes to erase our history. Once again, let's give a round of thanks to Mayuresh and Meenakshi for bringing attention to this urgent and underreported issue. And with that, this concludes our first session of Understanding Hinduphobia 2025, Hinduphobia Through Erasure. This morning, we have explored powerful and urgent issues: the ways media distorts Hindu narratives, the erasure of Hindu festivals on college campuses, and the ongoing silence around the persecutions of Hindus in Bangladesh. These discussions can be a lot to take in, so we encourage you to use this next hour to rest, reflect, and recharge. Please enjoy your lunch, take a moment to process everything we've covered, and we will meet back here at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for session 2. This next session will be just as impactful, featuring more Hindu American speakers and allies from other communities who will share their own experiences with erasure. It has been my pleasure to host this morning's session, and I now sign off as we transition to our next MC after the break. Look forward to seeing you all here soon.